3 nights, 3 attacks, nearly 1,000 kilometers from home. And Russia's response? They said it couldn't have happened. Think about that for a moment. Not "we stopped it," not "the damage was contained." Their official position, the line pushed by state media, military spokespeople, regional governors, and the Ministry of Defense itself, was that what Ukraine did was simply not possible, that the drones could not have traveled that far, that the routes did not exist, that someone else, somewhere else, must have been responsible. Because if they admitted the truth, they would have to admit something far more terrifying than any single attack. They would have to admit that their air defense network, the one built over decades, funded with hundreds of billions of rubles, tested in Syria, modernized year after year, and advertised to the world as an impenetrable shield, had just been humiliated, not once, 3 times, by a country a fraction of Russia's size, fighting a war it was never supposed to survive. That is where this story begins. Not with the drones, not with the fires, not even with the explosions that woke up Russian citizens hundreds of kilometers from any battlefield. It begins with a lie. And the reason Russia had to tell that lie reveals everything about the state of this war, the fragility of Moscow's position, and the extraordinary transformation of a nation that the world once wrote off as finished. Here is what actually happened, and why the spring of 2026 may be the moment historians look back on as the point when Russia's war machine began its irreversible unraveling. To understand why these strikes matter, you need to understand what Russia has been doing for the past 4 years. Russia does not fight wars the way smaller nations fight wars. It does not rely on surgical precision or rapid maneuver. It relies on mass, on the slow, grinding application of overwhelming force, sustained over years, financed by an economy that has one critical lifeline running through it like a vein: oil, natural gas, petroleum products, the raw commodities that have funded Russian military power for decades, that bankroll the defense budget, that pay the salaries of the soldiers, the engineers, the weapons manufacturers, that finance the missiles, that keep the lights on in the Kremlin. Military strategists have a name for what Russia has been attempting in Ukraine. They call it the economics of exhaustion. The idea is simple and brutal. If you cannot win quickly, you make the war so expensive, so prolonged, so grinding, that eventually your enemy simply runs out of the will or the resources to keep fighting. Russia has more men, more land, more oil, more time. At least, that is what the Kremlin calculated in February of 2022. Wear Ukraine down, outlast Western support, keep the money flowing, keep the guns firing. And for a long time, that strategy appeared to have logic behind it. That logic runs through 3 specific facilities on the Baltic coast of the Leningrad region, 3 locations that together form the financial spine of Russia's war economy. The first is the port of Primorsk, situated in the Leningrad region close to Russia's border with Finland. Not far from St. Petersburg, this is not merely a port. It is the terminus of the Baltic pipeline system, one of the most important pieces of energy infrastructure on the continent. Through this single location, approximately 1 million barrels of crude oil move every single day. 1 million barrels every day. The port also maintains 18 major fuel storage reservoirs, each capable of holding up to 50,000 tons of petroleum products at any given time. When you add it all up, the throughput, the storage, the tanker traffic, Primorsk handled close to 17 million tons of petroleum products in a single year. This is also a key docking point for Russia's so-called shadow fleet, privately owned tankers that quietly move sanctioned Russian oil to buyers around the world, bypassing the international restrictions designed to cut off Moscow's revenue. Primorsk is where that shadow economy lives. 17 million tons per year. At typical export prices, that is revenue in the tens of billions of dollars flowing directly into the Russian state budget, directly into the war. Then there is Ost-Luga, also in the Leningrad region, further down the Baltic coast. This facility processes around 700,000 barrels of oil each day. Ust-Luga also handles up to 45 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, producing millions of tons of liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas, products sold on international markets, generating enormous hard currency revenue. In a single year, Ust-Luga moves approximately 33 million tons of cargo. 33 million tons. That is more than the annual cargo tonnage of many entire national port systems. And it is all flowing out of Russia, being converted into cash, and flowing back in to fund a military operation that has already consumed staggering quantities of men and material. And then, sitting inland, is the Kynef refinery, the second largest oil refinery in Russia by processing capacity, handling 20 million tons of crude per year. Not just fuel for Russian consumers, petrochemicals, industrial feedstocks, products sold domestically and exported internationally, generating revenue at every stage of the supply chain. This is not a marginal facility. It is a cornerstone of Russia's energy economy, and the energy economy is the foundation on which everything else rests. Three facilities. Together, they represent the financial engine that makes continued Russian military aggression economically viable. You do not need a degree to understand this. No money, no war. It is that simple. And that is exactly why Ukraine made them targets. Not because they were easy, not because they were close, because hitting them is the most efficient way to attack the thing Russia values most. Not its territory, not its army, but its ability to pay for both. But here's the problem. These targets are not on the front line. They are not in occupied Ukraine, or even close to it. They are deep inside Russia, in the Leningrad region, one of the country's most densely monitored areas, hundreds of miles from Ukrainian territory, protected by layers of radar systems, air defense batteries, and early warning infrastructure. Getting drones there was not supposed to be possible. Russia said so explicitly. Its own military analysts dismissed the idea. The distance alone seemed prohibitive. Until now. On the night of March 23, 2026, the drones launched from Ukrainian territory. They did not hug the front lines. They did not strike a nearby depot or a border region. They flew north, then further north, crossing into Russian territory, threading through radar coverage, traveling through region after region, Bryansk, Smolensk, onward, covering hundreds of kilometers of defended Russian airspace. For hours, they flew, silent, dispersed, difficult to track individually, dangerous in swarms, and they reached Primorsk. The explosions came in the middle of the night. Residents across the area were jolted awake by the sound of blasts echoing across the water. Fuel storage tanks ignited. Fires spread across the port facility, moving from tank to tank. Firefighting crews rushed in, but the scale of the blaze was enormous. It would take days to bring it under any semblance of control. When the satellite imagery was eventually processed and analyzed, the damage assessment was damning. At least 8 tankers confirmed damaged, some of them vessels from Russia's Shadow Fleet, the very ships that have been quietly keeping Russian oil revenue alive despite international sanctions. Russia's air defenses that night reportedly intercepted more than 60 Ukrainian drones. 60. Let that number sit for a moment. 60 drones were shot out of the sky, and the port still burned. Because 60 was not enough. Because when Ukraine launches a swarm, the mathematics are ruthless. You can intercept the majority and still lose if enough get through. And enough did. Enough to turn the Kremlin's most important Baltic oil export terminal into a furnace visible from miles away. But Ukraine was not done. 2 nights later, on March 25th, the drone crews launched again. Same audacity, Same deep penetration into Russian airspace. Same outcome. The target this time was Ust-Luga, the other half of Russia's Baltic oil export infrastructure. Residents reported at least 10 distinct explosions rocking the area. 3 oil tankers were struck and damaged. Fuel storage tanks caught fire. Infrastructure belonging to Novatek, one of Russia's largest energy corporations, a company integral to the Kremlin's gas export strategy, was hit and destroyed. The terminal was sealed. Operations ceased entirely. And when emergency services finally got a handle on the fires and the facility tentatively began to reopen, it was functioning at a fraction of its normal capacity. Experts who analyzed the damage put the repair timeline at several weeks minimum. In a port processing 33 million tons of cargo per year, you can do the arithmetic yourself. 33 million tons divided by 365 days. That is roughly 90,000 tons of product every single day that is not moving during a shutdown. At market rates, every day of downtime costs Russia tens of millions of dollars. Not in damaged infrastructure, just in lost throughput, lost sales, lost revenue that will never be recovered because oil not shipped on a given day is simply gone. Every single day. And then March 26th arrived. This time, the Kyiv refinery. More than 20 Ukrainian drones penetrated Russian airspace and reached the facility. They struck, fires broke out, and once again, the regional governor, Alexander Drozdenko, who by this point had been forced to make 3 separate damage acknowledgments in the space of 4 days, confirmed that an unnamed industrial zone had been struck, offering as few details as he thought he could get away with. Because the residents of the surrounding area were already on their phones, images and videos flooded onto social media within minutes of the attack. Raging fires, towers of thick black smoke, the unmistakable visual signature of a major industrial facility burning from the inside. Satellite imagery taken in the hours that followed showed thermal signatures consistent with large-scale fuel fires at the refinery site. 3 attacks, 4 days, 3 successes, Primorsk, Ust-Luga, Kyiv, all burning, all of them hundreds of miles inside Russia, all of them classified as protected, all of them hit anyway. Here is where it gets serious. Russia's response was not a military counteraction. It was not a direct acknowledgement of the damage. It was not a strategic reorganization. It was a conspiracy theory, and not even a particularly sophisticated one. Official Russian sources put forward the claim that Ukraine could not possibly have flown drones that far through Russian airspace without being detected and destroyed. The drones, they argued, must have traveled a different route, west from Ukraine into Poland, north through Lithuania, across Latvia, across Estonia, then along the edge of the Gulf of Finland towards St. Petersburg. In other words, through the airspace of 4 NATO member states, with their full knowledge and active cooperation. This was a remarkable claim. It accused sovereign NATO members of direct military participation in strikes against Russian territory, an act that, if true, would represent a dramatic escalation of the war and a potential Article 5 scenario. Russia was essentially alleging that the Western alliance had crossed the threshold into open conflict. On each of the 3 nights in question, Russian sources, including the very Ministry of Defense making these allegations, reported air raid alerts cascading across the regions between Ukraine and the Leningrad region, Bryansk, Smolensk, region after region lighting up in sequence, following a path that runs directly northeast from Ukraine through Russian territory towards St. Petersburg. These alerts were issued by Russian authorities, logged in Russian systems, reported by Russian officials. They constitute a map drawn by Russia itself, showing exactly where those drones flew. And then there are the shoot-down numbers. On March 23rd, Russian sources reported more than 50 Ukrainian drones intercepted. On the 25th, 33 more. On the 26th, 21 more. That is well over 100 drones officially shot down by Russian air defenses. All of them, according to Russian official reports, engaged over Russian territory. Think about what Russia is actually claiming. They're saying that over 100 drones were shot down inside Russia, confirmed kills, logged by their own military, while simultaneously claiming those same drones never entered Russian airspace, that they flew through 4 NATO countries instead. The contradiction is not ambiguous. It is not subject to interpretation. It is documented, time-stamped, self-generated proof that Russia's official explanation is false. And the Russian government produced both sides of that contradiction themselves. Open-source intelligence analysts tracked the alert patterns in real time. The sequence was unambiguous. The drones flew through Russia. They always did. The path ran straight through the Russian interior, and Russia's own air defense systems were chasing them the whole way, and losing. Latvia's Ministry of Defense issued a formal statement. It was direct and unsparing. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had no involvement, zero, in planning or executing Ukraine's attacks. None. And then the Latvian ministry named what Russia was actually doing, a deliberate misinformation campaign intended to fracture NATO cohesion, sow doubt among European populations, undermine trust in Baltic governments, and erode the international consensus supporting Ukraine. This was not confusion. This was strategy. A strategy that, thanks to the documented evidence trail, failed completely. Russia did not blame NATO because the evidence pointed there. Russia blamed NATO because the evidence pointed directly at the most embarrassing possible truth: that Ukraine's drones flew 900 kilometers through the heart of Russian territory, past every radar installation and air defense battery, and struck their targets anyway. And there was nothing Russia could do to stop them. That is the truth the Kremlin cannot say out loud. Zoom out now. See the full picture. Russia has spent 30 years building a specific strategic identity. The message was consistent and deliberate. Russian territory is inviolable. Russian infrastructure is defended. The Russian military is a force that smaller nations do not provoke because the consequences would be swift and overwhelming. This identity was not just propaganda for foreign audiences. It was the foundation of domestic legitimacy. The implicit contract between Putin and the Russian population rested on the idea that Russia was strong, safe, and untouchable. Ukraine has been taking that contract apart, piece by piece, since the very first weeks of the war. It started small: border region strikes, depot attacks near the front lines. Gradually, the range extended. The ambition grew. The technology evolved. Ukraine's drone program did not begin at this level of sophistication. It got here through iteration, through battlefield learning, through engineering ingenuity driven by pure necessity. Each strike taught something. Each failure refined the approach. Each success emboldened the next operation. And now, in the spring of 2026, Ukraine has reached a capability threshold that Russia's entire defensive architecture was designed to prevent. Deep strike, sustained, accurate, against high-value economic targets, not just military ones. This is what military analysts call strategic interdiction, the systematic degradation of an adversary's ability to sustain war-making at the source. Not fighting the army in the field, cutting off the money, the fuel, the industrial capacity that feeds the army. It is the same logic that drove Allied bombing campaigns in the Second World War, the same logic that underpins modern long-range strike doctrine. And Ukraine is applying it with drones that cost a fraction of what they are destroying. The cost-exchange ratio here is extraordinary. Each Ukrainian drone costs somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars to produce and deploy. The infrastructure it destroys, a fuel storage tank, a berth, a processing unit, a tanker, can cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to replace. And the lost revenue from days or weeks of downtime dwarfs the replacement cost entirely. If you ran the numbers on what Russia would need to spend to intercept every single Ukrainian drone launched in a single month, at the rate air defense munitions cost versus the cost of the drones themselves, the arithmetic becomes catastrophic. Russia is spending more to defend against the threat than Ukraine is spending to create it. This is the trap, and Putin built it himself. He constructed a war economy utterly dependent on a small number of critical export choke points, Primorsk, Ust-Luga, a handful of other facilities. He funneled Russia's oil wealth through pipelines and terminals that were in theory far from any conflict zone. He launched an invasion premised on the assumption that Ukraine would fall before it could develop the capability to reach those facilities. And then, Ukraine did not fall. It adapted. It grew stronger. And it started reaching back. Every analyst who warned about Russian infrastructure vulnerability was dismissed. Every strategist who said a prolonged war would turn Russian energy assets into targets was ignored. Every voice that cautioned against betting the entire Russian economy on the assumption of a short, decisive victory was shouted down. And now those voices have been vindicated, not by theory, but by satellite imagery of burning oil terminals and governors scrambling to minimize reports of damage they cannot hide. The cascading consequences are already visible. Allies are watching and quietly recalculating. Nations that purchased Russian energy products, told themselves the arrangement was pragmatic, are now looking at disrupted supply chains and reconsidering long-term contracts. Russia's ability to project power through energy leverage, the tool it used for decades to keep European nations compliant and divided, is eroding. Influence bought with cheap gas and reliable supply requires both cheapness and reliability. Ukraine is systematically eliminating the reliability, and the war continues to drain what remains. On March 30th, just days after the Kiev strike, Ukraine hit Russia again. The city of Tolyatti in the Samara region, deep in the Russian interior, far from any front line, was rocked by 5 explosions in the early hours of the morning. A major chemical plant caught fire. Thick smoke columns rose into the sky. The same night, drones struck the Alkovsk metallurgical plant in the occupied Luhansk region, a facility that had once produced civilian steel and had been repurposed by Russia for military production. A large-scale fire broke out. Russia's air defenses, stretched across an enormous geography, failed again. This is not a trend. It is a doctrine. Ukraine is not striking randomly. It is working through a list. Infrastructure that powers Russia's war economy. Industrial capacity that feeds Russia's military production. Energy assets that fill the budget that writes the checks that keep the war going. Each strike is a calculation. Each successful hit removes another piece of the foundation. And here is what makes that calculation so relentless, so difficult for Russia to counter. Ukraine does not need to destroy these facilities permanently. It does not need to render them permanently inoperable. It just needs to keep them disrupted, keep the repair crews busy, keep the operations running below capacity, keep the insurance costs climbing, keep the export forecasts uncertain, keep the revenue projections unreliable. Because Russia's war is expensive, catastrophically, unsustainably expensive. The military salary bill alone runs into billions per month. The munitions consumption rate has been staggering. The equipment losses on the front lines have forced Russia to raid Cold War stockpiles, cannibalize civilian machinery, and import from partners of increasingly questionable reliability. Every ruble diverted to repairing a bombed oil terminal is a ruble not spent on ammunition. Every barrel burned in a storage tank fire is a barrel not exported, not sold, not converted into war funding. Ukraine understands this. This is not accidental. The whole logic of the campaign against Russian oil infrastructure is strategic compression. Force the Kremlin to make impossible choices. Defend the front or defend the economy. Fund the military or fund the repairs. Keep fighting or find a way out. Every successful strike tightens that compression by one more turn. Ukraine started this war in a position that looked, by any conventional military analysis, close to hopeless. A smaller population, a smaller economy, a military that, while brave and well-motivated, was outmatched in equipment, firepower, and resources by almost every measurable standard. In the first days of the invasion, the question was not whether Ukraine would win. The question was how many days it had left. That was 4 years ago. What has happened since then has no real precedent in modern military history. A smaller nation, under sustained assault from one of the world's most heavily armed states, did not merely survive. It adapted, it innovated, it built capabilities, almost from scratch, that now project force nearly 1,000 kilometers into enemy territory. It turned a desperate defense into a systematic campaign of strategic degradation. It transformed from a nation fighting for survival into a nation that is, by any honest assessment, winning the long game. The drone army that struck Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Kiev in those 4 days in late March is not the product of desperation. It is the product of 4 years of relentless engineering, battlefield learning, and strategic clarity. Ukraine knew that the path to ending this war ran not through grinding attrition on the front lines, but through making the war economically impossible for Russia to sustain. And it built the tools to walk that path. 3 strikes, 4 days, 50 million tons of annual export capacity disrupted. The Kremlin's most critical Baltic infrastructure, the infrastructure that funds the war, set on fire. Russia's air defense systems exposed, publicly, comprehensively, by their own documented failure to stop drones that their own officials reported shooting down in their own airspace. And the only narrative Moscow could produce in response was a story so transparently false that Russia's own casualty reports disproved it. Putin walked into this. He designed the trap himself, built the vulnerable choke points, launched the war, and handed Ukraine both the motive and the time to develop the means to reach them. Allies lost, revenue disrupted, myths shattered. The image of the impenetrable Russian fortress replaced permanently by satellite imagery of burning terminals and black smoke rising over the Baltic coast. That is not the posture of a military superpower. That is the posture of a nation losing a war it told itself it had already won. If you found value in this, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.